On June 22, 1944, four Soviet fronts launched Operation Bagration across a 450-mile arc of Belarusian forest and marsh. This offensive wasn't a gambit. It was the northern jaw of a trap designed by Marshal Georgy Zhukov in the Soviet High Command to stretch German reserves until they snapped. Within 72 hours, panzer divisions that had been earmarked for Army Group North Ukraine received urgent orders to redeploy, racing north to stem the bleeding around Minsk and Vitebsk. 18 armored and mechanized divisions had already been stripped from Army Groups North and Center in previous months. A third of Army Group Center's artillery, half of its tank destroyers, and 88% of its tanks had been shifted southward by early summer. What remained was a skeleton force, just 580 tanks, tank destroyers, and assault guns spread across hundreds of kilometers of front. The Germans were moving exactly as Zhukov had planned. 3 weeks later, 250 miles to the south in western Ukraine, Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front stood ready to spring the southern jaw. His 7 rifle armies, 3 tank armies, and 2 cavalry mechanized groups outnumbered General Oberst Joseph Harp's Army Group North Ukraine 2-1 in armor and 4-1 in aircraft. Soviet strength approached 1 million men, nearly 2,000 armored fighting vehicles, and over 11,000 guns. The coordination was deliberate and devastating. When 1st Guard's tank army swung northwest after the breakthrough, it would physically block 4th Panzer Army from reinforcing the collapsing center. These two offensives, separated by weeks and hundreds of miles, would function as a single strategic hammer. Army Group North Ukraine stood directly on the anvil. By early July, Konev's staff had achieved what German intelligence couldn't grasp. They'd transformed operational deception into overwhelming material fact. Along a 26-kilometer breakthrough sector west of Brody, Soviet engineers and artillery officers positioned roughly 6,240 guns and mortars. That's a concentration of 240 tubes per kilometer of front. The density exceeded anything seen before in the war's southern theater. During daylight, camouflage discipline remained absolute. Guns sat beneath netting woven with vegetation cut fresh each morning from nearby orchards, and crews replaced the foliage daily as leaves curled and browned in the July heat. The gun crews sheltered in dugouts scraped into tree lines, forbidden the comfort of cooking fires that might betray their positions to Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft circling at altitude. Even the smell of tobacco smoke was considered a risk. The deception went far beyond simple concealment. Following doctrine refined since Kursk, Maskirovka teams erected dummy artillery parks on secondary axes, complete with false radio traffic simulating entire formations that existed only in the imagination of German signals intelligence. Hundreds of fake vehicles and guns were built and positioned to draw attention. Real units maintained strict radio silence, while decoy networks chattered in patterns carefully designed to pull German attention toward sectors Konev had no intention of attacking. When Luftwaffe photo interpreters studied their reconnaissance prints, they saw concentrations, but in the wrong places and at the wrong scale. Fremde Heere Ost, Galen's intelligence apparatus, had detected Soviet buildup near Lvov. Their reports noted increased rail traffic, troop movements, and engineering preparations along the front, but the assessments consistently underestimated both the scale and the precise location of Konev's main effort. This was a pattern that had plagued German intelligence since Kursk, where they'd believed 1,500 Soviet tanks waited in reserve when the actual number exceeded 5,000, and where they'd missed roughly 1 million men entirely. Across the lines, General Oberst Harp commanded an army group stretched beyond sustainable limits. His divisions held frontages that doctrine deemed acceptable only in quiet sectors. The panzer reserves that might have provided operational depth were gone, locked in desperate combat 400 kilometers north, where Bagration's exploitation forces had shattered Army Group Center completely. When Soviet artillery officers synchronized their watches on the night of July the 12th, the disparity was already decisive. Harp's depleted divisions faced not merely superior numbers, but a concentration of firepower without precedent in the war's southern theater. And they remained fatally unaware of what dawn would bring. Among the formations awaiting Konev's assault was the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, roughly 11,000 Ukrainian volunteers deployed within 13th Army Corps, exactly where Soviet planning had concentrated its main effort. These men had joined for reasons as tangled as the war itself. Recruited in spring 1943 from Galicia, they carried memories of the first Soviet occupation, the deportations between 1939 and 1941, the executions in forests and basements, and the systematic erasure of anything resembling Ukrainian national identity. Post-war testimonies would repeatedly stress a single overwhelming motive: to fight Bolshevism, to prevent the Red Army's return at any cost. Some framed it in religious terms, a struggle against godless communism. Others saw the division as something more, a nucleus for future Ukrainian statehood, however unlikely German promises had proven. But ideology couldn't substitute for experience. The division had received only months of incomplete training before mid-February 1944, when, over SS Brigade Führer Fritz Freitag's explicit objections that his men were unprepared for combat, they were thrown into anti-partisan operations against Cedar Kovpak's Soviet partisan formations in the forests. That small unit warfare, hunting men through winter timber, bore no resemblance to what they now faced: high-intensity positional combat against the full weight of Soviet industrial warfare. They lacked their full establishment of heavy weapons. They relied on horse-drawn transport where German formations had trucks and half-tracks. Their artillery regiment fielded a mixture of captured and German howitzers, and their infantry carried standard carabiner 98K rifles, along with MG-42 machine guns, adequate equipment rendered meaningless by inexperience. Now they held the eastern perimeter near Pidhertsi Castle and Olesko, dug into positions that would become the Brody Pocket's killing ground. Private Mykola Shevchenko crouched in a trench carved into Ukrainian black soil, the same rich earth his grandfather had farmed 40 kilometers east before the first Soviet occupation. The walls of the position rose to his shoulders, shored with logs cut from a nearby birch stand. Splinters of white bark caught the faint starlight. Somewhere behind him, a horse stamped and snorted, one of the draft animals that pulled their field kitchen, now silent and cold because fires were forbidden. The air hung thick with the smell of turned earth and the sour tang of unwashed wool. His own uniform, damp with sweat that refused to dry in the July humidity. His hands rested on the wooden stock of his rifle. The grain felt slick with oil he'd applied the previous evening, working by touch in the darkness, because even the flame of a match could draw artillery. From the north came a sound like distant thunder. It didn't stop. The man beside him, Taras, a former seminary student from Ternopil, whispered that it was 42nd Corps at Horokhiv getting hit first. The thunder grew. It rolled across the horizon in waves that merged into a continuous vibration Mykola felt through the soles of his boots and through the packed earth beneath him. The stars above seemed to tremble in their fixed positions. This was different from anything he'd experienced. This was the sound of a factory operating at full capacity, of machines producing death in quantities that defied his understanding. He thought of the steel mills he'd seen in photographs before the war, the blast furnaces and the rivers of molten metal. The northern horizon glowed orange now, a false dawn that pulsed with each salvo. Taras was crossing himself. Mykola's throat had gone dry. He reached for his canteen and found it empty. He'd drunk the last of his water 3 hours earlier, and the supply wagons weren't due until afternoon, if afternoon ever came. At 0400 hours on July 13th, the northern assault opened near Horokhiv against 42nd Army Corps. Soviet 13th Army punched through German lines with devastating speed. By nightfall, the penetration had reached 20 kilometers, a rate of advance that shattered the assumptions upon which German defensive doctrine rested. The northern pincer was already turning south toward Rava-Ruska. Then, on July 14th, the second hammer fell directly on 13th Corps. The artillery preparation followed Soviet doctrine with precision that bordered on the mechanical. Batteries grouped every few meters along a 3 to 4 kilometer front delivered a rolling barrage that advanced 100 meters every few minutes. The Galician Division's forward positions near Podhirtsi and Olesko were systematically obliterated. Field telephone lines disintegrated in the opening minutes, forcing German commanders to rely on radio and runners who often never arrived. Observation posts were blinded by dust and smoke, and the few reports that reached Corps headquarters spoke of total disruption, of companies ceasing to exist as organized units. Above the artillery, 2nd Air Army added its weight. When German armor attempted to counterattack, 8th Panzer Division trying to shore up the crumbling line, Soviet Ilyushin II Sturmovix descended in waves. Over the course of these engagements, 2nd Air Army dropped 17,200 bombs on German tanks and columns, a torrent of ordnance that shattered counterattack formations before they could reach Soviet spearheads. The coordination was seamless: artillery preparation, then infantry assault, followed by armor exploitation, and finally air interdiction. Feldwebel Heinrich Brenner huddled in a battalion command post in the cellar of a farmhouse near Brody as the ceiling shook. Plaster dust drifted down in white curtains that coated everything. The radio set, the map spread across the table, and the face of the signals operator hunched over his equipment with headphones pressed to his ears. Each detonation sent new cracks racing across the stone overhead. There were no pauses between salvos. The explosions merged into a single, sustained roar that pressed against his eardrums until he could feel his pulse in his temples. The smell in the cellar was a living thing. Kerosene from the lantern, the chemical bite of radio batteries, the particular staleness of air breathed by too many men in too small a space. And underneath it all, the iron scent of blood. Gefreiter Muller sat in the corner with a field dressing wrapped around his left arm, the bandage already soaked through to a brownish red. The signals operator shouted that he couldn't raise regiment. Through the narrow cellar window, barely wider than his hand, Heinrich could see a slice of the world above. Smoke. A wall of brown-gray smoke that blotted out the July sun and turned noon into twilight. Shapes moved within it, running figures, impossible to tell if they were his men or the enemy. A horse galloped past, riderless, its mane streaming fire. The animal's screams cut through even the artillery, a high wailing that ended abruptly somewhere out of sight. The ceiling cracked. A chunk of plaster the size of his fist dropped onto the map table, scattering the carefully placed markers that showed positions which no longer existed. Division was ordering immediate withdrawal to secondary positions. Heinrich knew the secondary positions. He'd seen them that morning. They were nothing but shell craters and churned earth where trenches had once been. By nightfall on July 14th, Soviet forces had breached the German line at Nishay in the south, matching the northern penetration near Horokhiv. 13th Corps now protruded into a salient exposed on three sides. The Brody Pocket was taking shape. On July 16th, Konev committed his exploitation forces. General Mikhail Katakov's 1st Guards Tank Army and Mobile Group Baranov, held in reserve precisely for this moment. They poured through corridors barely 3 miles wide, still under artillery fire from German positions on the flanks, yet advanced with startling speed. Within 3 days, Baranov's mobile group had captured Kamyanka-Strumaloa and secured a bridgehead on the western bank of the Bug River, severing 13th Corps' escape routes westward. At the same time, General Pavel Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army drove through the southern Koltiv corridor, an even narrower passage under constant counterattack from 48th and 24th Panzer Corps. The corridor was a killing ground. German artillery bracketed the road continuously. But Rybalko's tankers pushed through with infantry clinging to their hulls, maintaining momentum that German mobile reserves couldn't match. The 8th Panzer Division commander disobeyed his movement orders and took a shortcut that left his attacks unsupported. Desperate counterattacks by 48th Panzer Corps against the Koltiv corridor dissolved under Soviet combined arms fire. By July 18th, Soviet spearheads from both pincers met near Busk, completing the encirclement. The breach in Army Group North Ukraine's front now measured 200 kilometers wide. 45,000 men of 13th Corps were trapped around Brody. The pocket was sealed. Private Taras Kovalenko moved through absolute darkness under the pines, one hand trailing along rough bark while the other clutched his rifle. He'd lost his unit sometime in the afternoon chaos. The last he'd seen of Corporal Hryhorek was a silhouette disappearing into smoke as another salvo landed. Now he walked alone through forest that seemed to breathe around him, each gust of wind stirring branches that sounded like whispers in a language he couldn't understand. His boots sank into a carpet of needles that muffled his footsteps, but released a sharp, resinous smell with each step, clean and almost pleasant against the background stench of cordite that had saturated everything for days. His canteen was empty. His throat burned. He'd found a stream earlier, but the water had tasted of something chemical and wrong. Runoff from the artillery, perhaps. He'd spat it out and kept walking. Somewhere ahead, a branch snapped. Voices, low and speaking in quick bursts. Russian. He pressed himself against the nearest tree, feeling bark dig into his shoulder blade. A flashlight beam swept through the trees, cutting a yellow tunnel through the darkness that passed 3 meters to his left. He stopped breathing. The light moved on. The footsteps receded. Taras didn't move for what felt like hours. When he finally allowed himself to breathe again, the air tasted of pine sap and his own fear, a metallic tang at the back of his tongue. He resumed walking. West. Always west. But the forest was endless, and somewhere behind him, tank engines growled. Inside the pocket, space itself became a weapon. 45,000 men compressed into a shrinking perimeter, measured first in kilometers, then in meters. The SS Galician Division and remnants of 13th Corps found themselves packed into an area barely 20 kilometers across by July 16th. German positions collapsing inward as Soviet pincers tightened from north and south. Each kilometer lost meant more men crowded into less ground and more targets for the artillery that never stopped. The bombardment intensified with arithmetic precision. Soviet gunners no longer needed to search for targets. Everything inside the pocket was a target. Shells fell in patterns, walking back and forth across assembly areas and crossroads, any point where German units might concentrate. 2nd Air Army flew sortie after sortie, with Ilyushin II Sturmovix dropping bombs on columns that had nowhere to hide. Dust clouds from explosions merged into a permanent haze that hung over the pocket like a funeral shroud, visible for kilometers in every direction. Supply lines existed only in memory. Ammunition stocks dwindled with each passing hour. Artillery batteries rationed shells to a handful per gun per day. Infantry companies counted bullets. By July 18th, the pocket measured perhaps 15 kilometers at its widest point. German radio transmissions grew desperate. Requests for relief attacks met with silence or promises that never materialized. Sanitator Karl Weiss pushed open the shattered door of a ruined church in Brody. The smell hit him first, a wet, heavy sweetness overlaid with ammonia and the copper-bright scent of blood exposed to air. The taste of it coated the back of his throat before he'd taken 3 steps inside. What had been a sanctuary was now a charnel house. Men lay on pews, on the floor, and against the walls. Some moved, most didn't. Morning light filtered through holes in the roof where artillery had punched through, casting bright shafts through the haze of flies that rose and fell in clouds thick enough to cast shadows. His boots stuck to the floor with each step, stones scoured clean 100 years ago by faithful parishioners, now covered in a film of things he refused to identify. A young soldier with shredded legs and tallow-colored skin whispered for water. Karl held his canteen to cracked lips and watched him drink. The canteen was nearly empty. There was no more. From outside came the sound of shells falling, distant but growing closer. The rhythm walked toward its target in measured steps. The blast hit the eastern wall. Stone and plaster cascaded inward. When the dust cleared, a section of roof had collapsed onto wounded men. A hand protruded from the rubble, fingers still twitching. Karl straightened. He wiped his eyes with a sleeve that came away gray. From the other side of the church came another cry for a medic. He walked toward it. What else was there to do? While men died in the Brody Pocket. Type Saxiu Aw, intensity medium. Soviet factories produced 1,200 T-34-85 tanks every month by mid-1944, an output that dwarfed anything German industry could sustain. The Kirov plant in Chelyabinsk turned out IS-2 heavy tanks at rates that would have seemed fantastical in 1941. These weren't theoretical numbers on production charts. They were steel vehicles rolling off assembly lines, loaded onto flat cars, and delivered to front depots where replacement crews waited to drive them into battle. When a Soviet tank army lost 50 vehicles in a breakthrough operation, 50 more arrived within days. When German panzer divisions lost the same number, those tanks were simply gone. Second Air Army's 17,200 bombs represented not just tactical air support, but the complete integration of aviation into combined arms warfare. Every sortie required fuel, ordnance, ground crews, and forward airfields, supplied by a logistics network the Germans could no longer sustain. Soviet artillery fired shells at rates that would have exhausted German ammunition stocks in days. Those 240 guns per kilometer that shattered 13th Army Corps continued firing because trains delivered thousands of tons of shells to railheads, where trucks carried them to battery positions in an unbroken supply chain. This was the unglamorous foundation beneath operational brilliance, the capacity to sustain violence at industrial scale. German commanders like Harp reported crippling ammunition shortages even before the offensive began. Soviet tank armies advanced hundreds of kilometers without the operational culmination that had limited earlier offensives, not because Soviet tankers were braver, but because fuel trucks kept pace with the exploitation. The Red Army had solved the arithmetic of modern war. By July 19th, 13th Army Corps had been encircled for 3 days. The SS Galician Division, positioned on the southern edge of the trap, organized the first major breakout attempt. They formed battle groups from shattered companies, assembled what remained of their transport, horse-drawn wagons loaded with wounded, and aimed for the narrow corridor southwest toward Zhukov. Soviet artillery had already registered every likely escape route. The roads became slaughterhouses. Gefreiter Victor Molnar's boots sank ankle-deep in mud the color of wet cement. Rain had fallen before dawn, a brief, violent downpour that turned the road into a river of muck. The column stretched ahead and behind, hundreds of men moving in silence, broken only by squelching footsteps and the occasional whinny of an exhausted horse. Then, the first Katyusha rocket announced itself. The sound arrived before the impact. A shriek that rose in pitch until it vibrated in his teeth and skull. Victor threw himself sideways into the ditch. Mud embraced him, cold and thick, closing over his legs and hips as the world erupted. The rockets fell in clusters. Each impact threw a fountain of earth and fire skyward. He pressed his face into the mud, feeling it ooze into his nostrils and the corners of his mouth. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only endure. When the barrage lifted, the road was gone. Where the column had been, only craters remained. A wagon lay on its side with one wheel still spinning lazily. The horse that had pulled it was scattered across 20 meters of churned earth. Steam rose from the remains. Someone was screaming, a shape in the mud that had once been a man and was now something missing pieces a man couldn't live without. Another rocket shriek split the air. Victor pulled himself from the ditch. His rifle was gone, lost in the mud. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't form a fist. He ran. Unteroffizier Lev Mikhailovich crouched behind a fallen oak at the edge of a clearing near Bilyi Kamen. The village was burning. Flames cast dancing shadows across the open ground, painting everything in shades of orange and black. The heat reached him even at distance, a dry, prickling sensation that carried the smell of burning pine and something organic underneath. His company, what remained of it, huddled in the darkness behind him. 11 men. There had been 96 when the offensive began. He studied the terrain. Open fields stretched to either side, flat expanses of unharvested wheat that would offer no cover when dawn came. A Soviet tank sat beside the church, its silhouette visible against the flames. His throat was raw. He'd drunk the last of his water 18 hours ago. He checked his rifle. 3 rounds remained in the magazine. When the fire dies, he told his men, "We move through the fields. Stay low. No one stops. No one helps anyone who falls. We reach German lines or we die." The flames diminished, collapsing inward. Soon there would be only embers. Soon they would move. By morning on July 22nd, the pocket had compressed to a square barely 5 miles across. The Fusilier Battalion abandoned Bilyi Kamen as Soviet artillery resumed its pounding. Inside the perimeter, thousands of men, German infantry, Ukrainian volunteers, and artillery crews without ammunition surged southward in a final desperate mass. This was no longer organized military maneuver. This was survival. The attack overwhelmed Soviet 91st Separate Tank Brigade through sheer desperation and weight of numbers. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted as encircled troops poured through the breach before Soviet reserves could seal it. Thousands escaped southward through that narrow corridor before the pocket collapsed completely by evening. Of 12,000 men from the SS Galician Division who entered the battle on July 13th, only 3,000 reached German lines. The rest lay dead in the forests around Pidurtsi and Olesko, or stumbled into captivity, or melted away to join Ukrainian partisan bands. Soviet reports claimed over 32,000 prisoners from the encirclement. 13th Army Corps ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Between July 22nd and July 27th, Soviet tank armies covered nearly 90 kilometers across western Ukraine, a tempo that gave Army Group North Ukraine no opportunity to establish coherent defensive lines. Lvov fell on July 27th, captured only 5 days after the Brody Pocket's destruction, not after weeks of positional warfare, but as part of a continuous operational sequence. Within 48 hours, lead elements of 350th Rifle Division reached the Vistula near Lvov-Sandomierz. Without waiting for bridging equipment, they began crossing in assault boats under darkness. By morning, entire armies were pouring across, expanding a bridgehead to 12 by 8 kilometers in a single day. The Vistula, a major water barrier that should have required days of preparation, had been forced on the march. Soviet forces had advanced over 300 kilometers in just over 2 weeks. German attempts to establish defensive lines dissolved before they could be manned. The Sandomierz bridgehead expanded despite German counterattacks involving 140 tanks. On August 13th, 14 Tiger IIs from 501st Heavy Tank Battalion encountered 11 IS-2 heavy tanks at 600 meters range. 4 Tiger IIs were destroyed outright, and 7 more were damaged. The sandy terrain allowed Soviet tanks to maneuver against thinner side armor. 3 Tiger IIs were captured while still operational. Panzerschütze Werner Hoffmann sat in his disabled Tiger II as smoke seeped through the hull seams. The transmission was gone. Emergency lighting cast a red glow across the interior. The hatch above his position was jammed, bent by the impact that killed the tank. The loader scrambled past, boot heel scraping his head. Then he was alone in red-lit darkness with smoke filling his lungs. Through the cracked vision slit, a Soviet tank was traversing its gun toward him. The engine compartment was on fire. Flames were spreading forward. He could feel heat through the floor plates. He tried the hatch one more time. It didn't move. Army Group North Ukraine reported 136,000 casualties between July 11th and the end of August. 55,000 killed, missing, and captured, along with another 81,000 wounded. 520 armored fighting vehicles were destroyed. 13th Corps alone accounted for 25,000 dead and 17,000 captured. Survivors remembered bombardment so intense that men committed suicide rather than endure another hour under the guns. Combined with Bagration's destruction of Army Group Center, over 500,000 German casualties, the summer 1944 campaign represented irreversible Wehrmacht collapse. Over 600,000 German casualties in 8 weeks. 62 divisions were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. The devastation was planned. Stavka directives in late May coordinated 2 massive offensives across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The interval between them was calculated precisely, long enough for Bagration to draw German reserves northward and short enough to prevent their redeployment before Konev attacked. The 2 offensives operated as coordinated elements of a single strategic design. The Red Army stood on the Vistula, 120 kilometers into Poland, holding bridgeheads that pointed toward the Reich. Hauptmann Friedrich Lange stood before the situation map at 4th Panzer Army headquarters, watching his adjutant remove unit markers that represented divisions which had ceased to exist. The blue symbols, neat rectangles and ovals that had looked reassuring on paper, were being peeled away one by one, leaving empty space where Army Group North Ukraine had been. The headquarters smelled of cigarette smoke, cold coffee, and the staleness of men who hadn't slept in days. Somewhere in an adjacent room, a teleprinter chattered. Another report from another unit, probably already overrun. 349th Infantry. Combat ineffective. Remnants absorbed into a battle group. The marker for D. 13th Corps was large. It represented 5 divisions and 45,000 men. The adjutant's hand hovered over it. "Remove it," Friedrich said. The marker came off the map. The adjutant set it beside the others, a pile of cardboard symbols that together represented the deaths or capture of tens of thousands of soldiers. A signals officer appeared. Field Marshal Model had assumed command. Orders would follow. Friedrich turned back to the map. The red arrows indicating Soviet advances dominated the board. They pointed west, always west. "What forces do we have between here and the Vistula?" he asked quietly. The silence stretched for 15 seconds. Rear area security battalions, a signals regiment, 300 replacement troops awaiting assignment to units that no longer exist. In the distance, faint enough it might have been imagination, came the rumble of artillery. The column of prisoners stretched for kilometers. Mykola walked with them, boots worn through at the sole. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. Guards walked alongside, young Soviets in clean uniforms. Somewhere behind, a man fell. The thud, the shouting, a single shot. The column kept moving. No one looked back. July heat shimmered off the road. His cracked lips were bleeding. He wasn't Mykola Shevchenko anymore. He was a statistic, one of 32,000 captured. The line shuffled forward. The guards shouted. The sun burned overhead. And somewhere to the west, beyond the horizon, the guns were still firing. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.